Creative Advantage Fund invests in companies because we make an equity investment. That's to say, we buy shares in the business, the creative business. We have to invest in a company. We can't invest in a person because we're buying a share of the business. And in the first round of investments, we invested by means of redeemable shares and preference shares. Redeemable shares are shares in a company which one party can require the other to buy back. And the idea was that if certain contractual triggers were pulled, if a certain level of achievement, a certain level of profit was made by the investee company, then they or someone associated with them would buy back from the fund the shares which the fund had acquired by reason of the investment. And in that way, the fund would get its money back and its profit. We also invested in so-called preference shares, which are somewhere between a share and debt. That's to say, you put money in and you're supposed to get interest if there are profits. The purpose of the preference shares was to try and cover some, at least, of the running costs of the fund, because obviously there's quite a lot of administration involved. As things turned out, the preference shares didn't really work to do that because there simply wasn't. Most of the companies did not make distributable profits in the early years, and so there was no liability to pay the interest, which simply accumulated. The other thing was that the preference shares, the accumulation of interest had to be showed in the company accounts, and some entrepreneurs, I'm thinking of one in particular, used to find it very worrying that this liability was piling up in his accounts on the preference shares, the debt, even though he didn't actually have to pay any of it unless and until he made profits. So it wasn't a problem, but psychologically it was rather problematic. We completed, as I say, our first round of investments at the end of 2001, and then we tried to manage those investments towards a profitable exit. And exit is one of the most important concepts that applicants for venture capital funding must understand, because an investor is interested in the end of the story, not just the beginning of the story. There must be an exit for the investor. The investor is not a philanthropist. He's not. Our instructions to the fund are make good investments, and the only good investments are the ones which make a profit. So however hard-nosed that may seem, that is the fundamental rule for venture capital investment. There must be an exit. Typically, an exit is a so-called trade sale. That's to say, there's some bigger company in the same line of work which buys the company from the original founders and the fund, and everybody then makes money. The most successful investment the fund made was in a company called Maverick Television. Maverick was ultimately bought by All3 Media, a much bigger company, and the fund made a very substantial profit, and so of course did the original founders of the business. And this is the second thing that applicants have to understand about equity finance, that it's much better to own 50% of a company that's worth $1 million than 100% of a company that's worth 100,000. So applicants, creative business people must understand that they are giving over a share of ownership of their company with a view to maximising the value of what they retain. So that instead of having 100% of a small company, you have a share of a much bigger company, and your share is much bigger than what you originally had. That's capitalism. The redeemable shares mechanism actually never really operated according to its terms. We never actually had to use the redeemable shares in a formal way, because when an event occurred which allowed us to cash out of an investment, it was always by agreement. So when we had essentially made all investments and realised almost all of them by about 2008, we had about £1 million then to get back to work with. I decided that the best thing to do was simply to forget about the preference shares, which were more trouble than they were worth, to forget about the redeemable shares and just have shares. So we are pure venture capitalists. We just buy a share in the company and we look forward to the day when there will be the exit. And part of the case that an applicant has to make to a venture capitalist is that there is an exit. And that's not just saying there will be a trade sale, that's saying there are these companies which may be interested in buying us. There was this transaction recently where a similar company was bought by that company, and so forth. Of course, for completeness, one should say that if an investee company is terrifically successful, then it's not impossible that there could be a flotation, that's to say a quotation on a stock exchange. That's never happened to CAF, and it's a rare occurrence.